today I'm going to talk to you about a body of work I've been working on for about the past 5 or so years called Occupants, which you see here. And it's essentially sort of my reinterpretation or reimagining of a form of portraiture called occupational portraiture, in which you see the subjects through the lens of their daily lives, roles, or professions. Before I get to the current work, though, I'm going to talk about some of my earliest influences, and then some of the research I did into this genre and how those two things sort of came together to help sort of create this body of work. So first I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. Like many children of the 80s, Star Wars was sort of the first thing that kind of exploded my visual imagination. I grew up in suburban/rural Kentucky, and I didn't really have access to museums or art galleries. The sort of art world wasn't really part of the vocabulary of my early life. So popular culture was really the way I came to understand this sort of imaginative visual world. And Star Wars, like many young kids in that scenario, was the first thing that really spoke to me. So when I saw these movies at, age 6 or 7, I started sort of obsessively making drawings of these characters and also of my own characters that were basically kind of rip-off of the Star Wars world. Another thing I discovered early on in the small town I grew up in was that if you went to the magazine section of the grocery store, you could also discover sort of a wider world of pop culture. And I became a fan of Mad magazine. I liked the way they would take figures from popular culture, like Yoda, for example, and sort of tinker with them, poke fun of them, sort of satirize them. As I got a little older, I got very into baseball cards. Kind of like the Star Wars action figures, I liked the way that they were sort of uniform. They were all the same, but if you looked at each one, they were also idiosyncratic. The uniforms were different, the poses were different, the colors were different, though they ultimately sort of all fit into one specific design. Again, I liked sort of versions of popular culture that would tinker with an established format and sort of poke fun at it. Garbage Pail Kids would take a format like the baseball card and satirize it. So early on, all of those things were sort of swimming around in my young head. And recently I discovered this drawing I did when I was 10 years old. I had completely forgotten that I made it. This was published in my local newspaper when I was a kid. And what you see here, if you look closely, it's actually George Washington. He's got his George Washington haircut, he's got his ascot, but he's dressed up like a skateboarder with his flip hat, his checkered shorts, and his Chuck Taylors. So seeing this image, and again, I'd completely forgotten that I did it, it sort of struck me like a thunderbolt. First to see just how much those early things influenced me that I spoke of earlier, but also to see the degree to which an image like this that I drew when I was 10 still sort of presents itself in the work I make now. As I got to be a teenager, my sort of pop culture obsession kind of laser focused into the realm of music. And kind of like baseball cards before, the album cover became a format that I was similarly obsessed with. Album covers were all the same, but they were all different. They had to fit into a certain format. They tended to be a portrait of the artist, but those individual qualities of each artist were sort of brought forth in each individual album cover. So here you can see some of my early works. And I think what you'll see is it's like all those early influences sort of are put in a cauldron, swirled around, and these images speak to a lot of those influences. I think sometimes the first decade or so of your making as you become an artist is really just about processing your influences, establishing what format you want to work in, figuring out how things work technically. And at the end of this period, I'd sort of established that some sort of alternative form of portraiture was the thing that I wanted to do and pursue, but I also wanted to figure out a way to kind of unify it and bring it all together in a fashion that might make some sort of a broader statement. So I had to really kind of investigate what was it about portraiture that interested me. And I came to kind of a paradoxical conclusion, which was I was fascinated with this genre of portraiture, but I wasn't interested in individuals. I didn't want to bring my friend over to the house and put them next to the window and try to sort of capture their individual essence the way the light was hitting them. I was interested in all the sort of peripheral things. I was interested in archetype, the symbology of portraiture, the clothing, the settings, the objects that surrounded the figures. And I thought, okay, there's this paradox in terms of the way I approach portraiture. Maybe I could use this as an advantage rather than a deficiency. So I took some time to research, at first, portraiture at large, and then became aware that I was really interested in a subgenre of portraiture, what you might call occupational portraiture, seeing people through the lens of their daily roles, professions, working lives. I started to accumulate these images and sort of seek them out from lots of different sources. And I realized there was a paradox about this work as well, which was, as you look at these images, you can sort of discern a lot of information about these characters, maybe something about their socioeconomic situation, maybe their geography, maybe their place in history. You can probably deduce certain things about their daily routines. But the figures at the core ultimately sort of remain a mystery. You don't know anything about their personal lives. You don't know what their favorite book is, what their favorite musician is. So these images, in a sense, had sort of a mask-like quality, and they also presented a paradox. So I thought, okay, here's two paradoxes that interest me in terms of portraiture. Maybe I can continue to consider that and sort of filter that into my own work. Soon into my research, I became familiar with the work of August Sander, who is an early 20th century German photographer, and he essentially made his entire life work the pursuit of the occupational portrait. He went all throughout Germany and just found hundreds of subjects which he photographed in the context of their daily occupations. And I thought, okay, here's someone that really made an entire life's work out of this. Maybe I could pursue a similar project, but sort of filter it through the aesthetic that I've developed from the early influences that I had already started to sort of seek out in the first 10 years of my making work. So here you see one of the first attempts of me sort of trying to establish this occupational portrait format. And what you see is the subject, the hunter, in the sort of clothing, the object, several signifiers in a setting that speak to that occupation. It sort of suggests some of the earlier aesthetics I had established in some of my earlier painting, but to me it felt a little bit too conventional. It felt like I was sort of rehashing this sort of subgenre rather than taking it to a different place. So I decided I should ditch the settings. I should stop thinking about these as circumstances you might actually encounter in real life, but maybe the sort of human form can almost be sort of like a surface that I'm just building symbols on. And that might free me up to take it to a different place. And once I did that, they started to become more sort of overtly symbolic, more bizarre, more humorous in some cases, and they just really allowed me the freedom to go in lots of different directions while still maintaining this very sort of specific format. So once I had established that method of working, I was sort of off and running. What you see here are paintings that are actually made from real-life models. The way I construct these, I actually take a mannequin bust and I accumulate lots of objects that speak to any given occupation for the subject of the painting. Now, some of them I just sort of encounter in my daily life. Sometimes I'll seek out objects on eBay, and I'll bring all of these sort of symbolic objects together and start to cover up the form of the model until it becomes this sort of mask-like creature. Now, some of these objects speak very specifically to the symbolism of the occupation, but some of them I started to find I just needed to incorporate to hold these models together. So you start to see strings, ribbons, pieces of cloth. And as that started to happen, I just let that sort of become part of the language of the pieces. When I first started this project, I didn't really know how to approach meaning. Sometimes when you start a big undertaking, You're just trying to deal with all the practicalities, and meaning is something that sort of arrives later. So it wasn't until about 2 years, 3 years into this project that I started to have ideas about the meaning of this work. Now, I don't necessarily think I'm an authority on the meaning. I think anytime you're making creative work, meaning exists somewhere between the maker and the audience, in that space and interaction between the two. But I have started to sort of develop some ideas about the meaning of these. I think on some level they are about that negotiation between revealing aspects of yourself and concealing aspects of yourself when you are entering into the sort of professional, adult, daily routine sort of working world. I think on some level they're also about some of the absurdities of the conventions and conformities that we have to contend with when we're entering into that world as well. I think on some level they're about the desire to belong. But more than anything else, I sort of think they're about the kind of never-ending, improvisational, idiosyncratic construction of the version of ourselves that we want the world to understand and absorb. That's sort of a lifelong process, and you might also call it a work in progress. Thank you all.